So if somebody was to ask you, like, who is Michelle Beech, what would you say in this conversation of leadership?
Wow, what a great question. But you didn't give me that in the prep.
No, but I mean, it's just an introduction.
That is who I am. I am fun loving, sunshine, always see the positive and opportunities with people, the best of people. I don't want to see the worst of people. I um I think who I am as a leader is that comes through in the trust that I give to those who have worked underneath me in hierarchical organizations or those who work alongside me and other, even including volunteer organizations, that I really try to find what are the gifts within those that I work with and elevate those gifts, give the stage to the people to prove themselves, to let them shine. And so, who I am as a leader is really, I guess, probably more a cheerleader than anything else. I certainly am not a coach. I don't hire people and then try to tell them how to do their jobs. I like to think that I am the type of leader that recognize what the gifts are in the room because we all have them and
Mm,
help make connections between both people and needs to use the gifts to the best of our abilities as a team.
mm, thank you. That's really good. So from the write-up that I shared with you, the one of the things that we are trying to do as lead integrity, as we talked about this, is to really model a kind of feminist ethical leadership that critiques the what we would call some of the toxic leadership styles that that have adopted what Berit or calls the five master suppression techniques, which is making invisible, ridiculing, withholding information, damned if you do, damned if you don't, and finally the fifth one is the heaping blame and the putting to shame. So in each of those elements, you see how like making invisible involves like ignoring and or overlooking someone's contribution, and you and me have experienced all that. But so from this, if we are saying feminist leadership critics this, I just want from the sample questions, if you could offer some scope that gives a kind of analysis of
Sure.
certain leadership styles that you have experienced.
Mhm. I have experienced all five of these types, and I'll have an example for you of each of those. But I think it's also important that you understand that I'm coming at this from a frame of being um, a I guess a third wave feminist might be the best description, because while I am all raising women up and
Mhm,
giving them a platform where they perhaps haven't had one, I also feel that it's important that we do that across the aisle,
mm,
and that to some degree there is an element of responsibility on the part of men to help us with that, as well as just knowing that all people are gifted in different ways, that their own experiences may also lend favor to helping women within the workplace or other organizations, and that we can't completely sideline the guys just for the sake of elevating the women. And so when I reviewed kind of these 5 points and my own experiences and my reactions to them, I would have to say that my initial instinct is also to look for the other possible part of the story. In other words, I could easily say, for instance, making invisible involves ignoring or overlooking women's contributions. And I can't say that I've had that in a live situation, but it has affected my legacy. So when I have left a job, typically a man coming in behind me would try to erase my legacy of the work that I did in that place, and was given a lot of credit for that work, by either taking ownership of the last chapter of what I did, or trying to render irrelevant whatever that work was that I was working on when I moved on to a different job. So in a sense, the making invisible wasn't something I personally experienced live in the workplace, but definitely knew for sure and had heard through other colleagues that this was happening when I would leave a job. And I think erasing the legacy is just as important to address as in real time. But of course, I wasn't there to stand up to it or to challenge the fact that it was happened. By the time I knew that it was happening, I had moved on and was in another, work situation. But I keep saying, well, okay, here's my example of looking for the other part of the story, is that yes, those were men that did that. But as you pointed out, our workforces are dominated by men. So there's a predominant chance that a man was going to be the one that came behind me, and out of his own need to say, hey, I'm the new guy, I'm smart, here's why you hired me, needing to feel like they deemed the prior person irrelevant in order to make themselves feel more secure
Relevant.
in their new job, right? So just because I recognize that that really was an act of that, it very well was probably more to do with making him feel more secure in this job that he's just beginning, right? So there's always another side to the story. My point in that. Well, and I think moving on to the ridiculing, again, I was in a career that was in media, and I was in media enough of generations later that there were certain behaviors in the workplace that were not acceptable. So the women like Barbara Walters that went before me, they really had to deal with a lot of this stuff that for me, by the time I came along in the same industry, it was a moot point. And while it may have been there, it was certainly more subtle. But I do remember one time, and it wasn't, again, it was around a job, not within a job, but I had applied for my first management job. And I really wanted the job because it was only an hour away from where my parents had recently moved to retire. And at that age, I was about 30, but at that age, someone in retirement is really old. And so, so right. So I really felt like I needed to get closer to my parents so I could help out. And so I really wanted this job. And it was a little scary because it would have been the first time I moved from being a producer of content in a television station to being a manager, a department head. And I went out and I had an interview with what turned out to be a different man who was not the man who was the hiring manager that I'd been speaking to on the phone. And it also turned out, because that was the man that they had just announced that day was taking over. He was very much a misogynist. And I was basically left to follow him everywhere we went around the building and to lunch by several paces behind him. And then when the call came about the job, he had decided he really wanted his own person in that position, but he wanted to call and offer me a secondary position. He said, you can be an assistant department head or manager and work under this person, which probably in terms of experience, probably could have been a good thing. And I really wanted that job to be close to my parents. But when he called and offered me that, I was on the fence and I asked, what about moving expenses? And, it's only wise to ask what the benefits package is going to include. And so his response was to laugh at me and say, well, how much stuff could you have? Like it was ridiculous of me to even consider asking for moving expenses.
Wow.
So needless to say, I didn't take the job because I didn't want to work for somebody like that. But that kind of dismissiveness and mockery is certainly something that I know many women have to deal with. And I have been fortunate enough to only have a little taste of it in that regard. And that's really because I came along in the industry I had a career in late enough that all these other wonderful, wise women, unfortunately, before me had to put up with a lot more of that. But one of the things that probably is the most common that I have encountered is the withholding information. And I would show up to meetings, mainly the only woman in the meeting. And I probably say in the last part of my career, I might not have been the only woman in the room, and it was still happening even then. But I would show up to meetings and someone would, in the conversation of a group, would say something that everybody would look to me like, don't you have this information? And so what happened is somebody should have passed along some info to me so I could be able to form whatever it was I needed to present, or be able to have some thought about at the very least in this management discussion. But I would show up and be made to look like I was ill prepared because I didn't know, I didn't have it, didn't have the information. And so whether that was an intentional act, I don't know. Whether that was a subconscious thing that some of the men that I worked with were doing and didn't even realize they were doing. Again, I am always looking at what is the other possibility or the other part of the story here. But that's the one I most directly encountered all throughout my career, was showing up inevitably at a meeting and it made it look like I was not prepared. And it was only because they were working on something and they didn't let me know about it. And so, I don't think it is on the woman. Certainly wasn't on me every single time to go digging for information and making sure that I have all the knowledge before a meeting if it really wasn't, the ball wasn't in my court in the first place. So that was something, and that still, even as I transitioned out of the industry specifically and became an independent contractor, that it was still happening just 4 years ago. So, and then, the damned if you do, damned if you don't. I think when I have experienced it, it was when a manager really wanted to get rid of me. And that hasn't happened much in my life, but I can look back on a handful of times when a manager would say, why didn't you do this? And so you switch gears to do it that way. And then that's not good enough, or it wasn't fast enough, or I shouldn't have had to tell you in the first place. It really truly is damned if you do, damned if you don't.
Mhm.
And in every single case that happened, my first job and my last job in my career. So I don't, somewhere in there, I'm sure a few other times, but those two instances I can think of, the first was a sexual harassment potential suit, and they knew I wasn't going to play. So they found every way they could to push me out the door. And the second time, the last part of my career, it was a new general manager who wanted his own person in my position, but he had no justification for firing me. And so he just did his power to make my life miserable so that I would quit. And for the longest time, I wasn't going to give him that satisfaction. But, at some point, you have to decide, is how much is the principle of this worth fighting for? And
Mm.
how much is your own peace of mind and less stress in your life, your health sometimes justifies letting it go.
Yeah.
And so every circumstance is different. He was that was a situation that I probably could have consulted an attorney, a labor attorney. I didn't, because by then I was ready to move on in my career anyway.
Mm.
But I still feel that, it's people like that that get into positions of power and then no one challenges them. And even
Yeah.
the handful who have challenged them often find that the HR machines, as I would call them, particularly with big companies, they just have a way of really, they obviously represent the company. Human resources in America do not represent the employees. And so they want the employees to feel that way, but that's not the reality. And so when you challenge anything, or if you were to say this particular manager is a problem within your organization, they're
Mm.
always going to side by the person who is bringing in the most money. And I was in a position of marketing, but not in sales. And so in that situation, I probably would not have gotten a lot of favor with the human resources of the corporation.
Mm.
But there's just, it was interesting though to live through that, where I really was in a position where he wrote me up officially to put me on, notice. I had a 30-day, had to meet with him regularly, and he said, here are the problems I'm having with you. And within 24 hours, I responded with, here are all the things I'm going to do to address the problems you have with me. And I didn't give him anything he could use to fire me. And so I don't think he saw that coming, frankly. And I know I could have dragged it out longer and it would have been more and more miserable for both of us. Probably. But like I said, I had been in that industry for more than 30 years and I was just ready for a change. And
Mm.
if it had been a different person, a different manager, I might have tried to stick it out. Or if I had envisioned that he might have been short term, I might have stuck
Mhm.
it out. But I really felt like this was going to be the norm for me for a very long time. And that wasn't worth it to me. I just felt
Mm.
life's too short. And so I walked away from it. I did not challenge it. Um, and then the last the last point on heaping blame and putting to shame, thankfully, I haven't had to deal with a lot of that. I have had a couple of tyrants
Mhm.
had to work with through the years, one directly, and then one was a client. And the client, that was a situation where I was kind of the outside consultant coming in. The situation was my company did research
Mm.
and made strategy recommendations, which we all agreed with our clients. This is the strategy. It's directed by primary research. We're listening firsthand to your customer and
Mm.
putting a strategy together based on that. This is not the whims of some marketing genius. This is literally data driven. And every time I would show up at this place, this man would throw a temper tantrum. And probably the biggest temper tantrum, he did it with all of his staff. It wasn't just me.
Ah, okay.
He was a tyrant. But
Mm.
on, I think probably the last visit, he was actually removed from that position eventually. But on my last visit, where I saw him, he had this kind of tantrum in the hallway and as loudly and as publicly as he possibly could, basically blaming me for all of the ills of the TV station. And what basically the rest of the staff knew was that he would continually diverge from the strategy. So he didn't follow the strategy and then be able to say your strategy didn't work. He didn't do that. He would continually take his staff off focus and go in completely different directions away from the strategy, and then wanted to blame me when it didn't work.
Mm.
So, but he had, a tendency to do that. And I think he was harder, frankly, on the women in that office. He had a female news director, and when she wound up leaving, she left the industry entirely. So I
Oh.
think it just literally left that kind of an impact on a lot of women when we just get to a point where we're just so tired of dealing with it in any of these forms. And it also is frustrating because some days you find yourself saying, why did these jerks get into positions of power in the first place?
Mm. Mm.
How do they stay in positions of power? Why are they protected? So there's a systemic problem there.
Mm. Mm.
Yes, there's a handful of individuals, and I've had wonderful, wonderful, smart, savvy, thoughtful, compassionate leaders that I have been so grateful to work with, more so those than the worst.
Mm.
But it does happen. It's our tendency, particularly the way I was raised, um, you don't you don't ruffle feathers. You don't, it's hard to stand up to bullies. And,
Mm.
um, especially if your job's on the line and you can't afford to lose the job, right? I think people stand up to bullies when they're actually still already ready to walk out the door. But if
Mm.
more people who aren't ready to walk out the door would come together and stand up as a whole body of people rather than a single person
Mm.
alone trying to do that, that could certainly begin to perhaps make a shift within organizations. I was thinking too about what else has made a difference,
Mhm.
and I think it's when there's been a team. So whether you work in a team or you act as a team, right? Depending on what your
Mm.
jobs are and the responsibilities for each person. But I don't think that anything extraordinary happens in a vacuum anyway. And so when we when we collaborate, when we work as teams, it serves to build up all the parties and the entire the project as a holistic project, as well as protect the vulnerable parties that may be part of that team. That otherwise, without the team, the vulnerable parties would be more challenged to be able to stand up to anything, or have to continue to deal with these things that these systems continue to foster. Just my
Thank you so much. So in each of it's good that you've really the way you've summed it up, and then now really zooming into one of the components of good like survival in the face of such toxic leadership is to stand together, to work together as teams. But I am interested to hear from you, because from each experience that was toxic, you are somebody who had the courage to say, I cannot allow this to continue being part of my life. I'll be kind to myself, you know, I will move on. To you, what, like in any of these cases that you have narrated, maybe the first one really would be difficult because it was after you had left. But in each of these cases, what kind of feedback did you get? Did the people that you were dealing with that were manifesting this kind of toxic kind of elements of leadership, did they ever come to you and apologize, or sat with you and said, oh, you know, like this other guy who said, this is what's wrong with you, and you said, this is how I'm doing, addressing these things? Was there any point when you sat down to really like talk and resolve the issues?
Not really. There was one that I felt may have withheld information that I continue to this day to have a friendship with. And but I really don't believe they knew they did it intentionally. And it wasn't, it was once, but I don't, maybe there was some subconscious thing perhaps, but I think more than anything, he was just a poor communicator. And he was so focused on his own thing, his world, and what he was coming up with, that he would show up to these joint meetings without bringing me into the loop ahead of time. And I just think it was frankly a bonehead move. I don't think there was any ill intent.
Okay.
And but the others, the people that I hear from are the people that were the extraneous. They would have been perhaps part of a team that unfortunately wasn't operating as a team at that time. But those that I've kept in touch with, or those who have reached out since, thanks to social media, we're able to keep track and with friends that we worked with long ago. And so most of the time I feel validated, and that it wasn't just in my mind, because I've had numerous people that it's kind of the after fact where you kind of talk about how horrible that old boss was. Right? So I know that it wasn't just me, but what's unfortunate is that in the moment when we could have come together, we weren't communicating enough to rally and stand up to it. And depending on the organization, either fear of being blackballed or losing a job and a source of income, those are pretty big reasons to keep people silent in the first place. but I find that that's just the reason we're still having these conversations, is because the human resource machines within corporations anyway, and perhaps boards of NGOs that are stacked in a certain way with a certain type of people. Either way, you've got real strong, powerful people that have a lot of money or resources to fight it. And when you try to stand up to it as an individual, you're either going to be outspent with the money, or you're going to be blackballed. Your reputation is going to be impacted. And so you fear being able to get a job elsewhere because, people talk. So I think figuring out a way to bring teams together, whether that may not be the right word in every circumstance, but bringing people together in some way so that there is some solidarity, and people don't feel so isolated when things like this happen. Is certainly a piece of important leadership training, I think, that should be available.
So yeah, thank you. Because I actually, you kind of, you have addressed something that I wanted to ask you about, which is very good. Because I've listened to many people who are in a kind of toxic leadership relationship in their workplace. And most of the times, they will tell you a list of what is not going on well and how it is so difficult for them. And yet, when you say, okay, so what are some of the options that you can take? Leaving is not one of the options they will give you. And precisely because they think in terms of, how do I jeopardize this opportunity when I don't even know where I would end up? And so it brings up this question of solidarity that you mentioned at first. And you've also mentioned again that how, it would make quite a big difference if there was kind of solidarity within a work environment, so that no one who is going through some difficult challenges because of certain leadership and the way they view you should stand on their own and fear for their future. And this is very important, I think, for me, because you have, from the beginning, when you were introducing yourself, you said you actually, you have really taken the intersectionality very seriously. And the intersectionality part of it, of course, if you read Elizabeth Schuster Fiorenza, the one who has written so many books, she's actually known as the one who also did a lot of. She's the pioneer of the feminist hermeneutics. Feminist hermeneutics, because she's a biblical scholar. Okay. She, looking at Kimberly Crenshaw, the one who actually coined the terminology intersectionality. Elizabeth Schuster Fiorenza has redefined the enemy that feminists are facing, so that it's not patriarchy anymore. It is what she calls kyriarchy. And kyriarchy, she defines it as this acknowledgement of multiple belongings at the same time, and that you know what you fight now, the form of oppression that you fight is the oppression of lordship, of the kind of oppression that intersects at different levels of your multiple belongings. So you are Black, you are a woman, and you are maybe not very educated, and then you probably and so on and so forth. You are a religious minority, you are maybe a member of LGBT. So all these multiple belongings that disadvantage you. So Kiriake becomes that kind of a suppression that is actually really taking, like pressing you at each level of your multiple belongings. So in that case, if you take an intersectionality of looking at these questions of leadership and how certain practices of leadership are manifested. I was working for an international organization, and actually the sad part was that at first I was like, the leadership in the organization were very, like very supportive of my work. Oh, Fulata, you are very innovative, you are very courageous, all these things. And then a female leader came, and guess what? She came from Africa. Anyway, sorry. So she comes, and for whatever reason, she believes that she's so special. That's why she's in that position. And now, because she has taken up this tokenism, the warehouse oppression can turn you into a token, and you think that you are really special, and then you think that associating with the other people who are like you, like female, and also they are Black like you, they will actually threaten your advantages. They will threaten your special position. So I started suffering because, and she was not even subtle about her things, that her exclusion of me. She told me in person, she says, it's either me or you. Yeah. And she was at leadership level. So for me, it didn't make sense that she should actually reduce herself. I was a program staff, okay? So if you are in management and I am program staff, and you come to me to say it's either you or me, because I'm also a specialist in gender and feminism, therefore it's either you and me. I'm looking at you and I'm saying, why are you disadvantaging yourself and reducing your impact and influence? Because the moment you start fighting with me at the level of program, you are already losing it at the level of leadership. Because your fellow leaders who are male, they will see that and they will keep on trivializing your leadership. I mean, that's the way I look at it. But because also fellow members of staff at my level could see that there was, like, I was disadvantaged, I was looked at, and they would come to me, they would whisper to me, we think you are a threat to her because, whatever. And that was not very helpful for me, because what it did was, still they would whisper to me, but in public they would show their alliance to the leadership. And so I would fight on my own. So when we talk about this solidarity, I don't know if you have suggestions of like what can be put in place in organizational systems and structures that would do actually ensure that there is a kind of established solidarity. Because if you leave it to the goodwill of individuals, they will always be thinking about their own plight, their own advantages, their own way. So they will always think that you are expendable. So I was looked at as somebody who was expendable. And they would come to me and say, oh, you are very gifted. You find something, even if let's say they pushed you out of here, you are you will find something, but yet I was suffering alone, and I didn't want to be pushed out. I didn't want to leave, because I like everybody else who thinks they are very vulnerable and they don't have many chances. I looked at myself. I'm a Black woman in Europe, in Switzerland. I don't have very good command of French. Okay. And I have not really, because the way my organization was working was like you were all over the world, but not in Switzerland. So we didn't have really established links with the local communities who could have absorbed me in case of, being pushed out. So what like if we are talking as lead integrity, we are saying we are offering models of leadership that probably takes up this issue of solidarity, like inbuilt solidarity that safeguard and protect those who could otherwise be vulnerable. What would be some of the things that this kind to safeguard this kind of leadership would entail? Would it be policies? Would it be
I think,
training? What kind of training?
well, I think all. I think the answer is yes. um, Again, I think to have a holistic organizational transformation, you have to have holistic solutions. So, training to make awareness, first of all,
Mm,
people are not aware and they're not aware of the possibilities. So, various trainings. But I was also thinking as you were first speaking, until you got into the part of the structure of the organization being divided, I think taking a look at the operations and the structure of each organization certainly would impact the strategy for how you do this. But I just kept coming back to people's gifts. I might have
mm,
mentioned that earlier in my introduction, but I find that everybody is gifted in a variety of ways. So going back to your superior who saw you as a threat because you had some of the same education that she had some same expertise in this kind of niche area. If there was um, not a program, but if there was a process within an organization that was just adopted to be part of how we operate, and
mm,
each time someone is onboarded, they go through this process. But if the organization as a whole can recognize the diversity within each person of the organization, then that person isn't just seen as a threat because of this one speciality. They are
mm,
recognized for, oh, but Fulata also has this or this, which we really need for our program over here, but she's not talking or working with the department over here because we never knew about that gift in the first place.
mm,
So doing a deeper dive into all of the gifts, not just the skills and the education, but truly
Mm-hmm.
gifts of people. You know, in at least in the United States, if you're in a sales position, like you're in the one going and finding advertisers or the money making people getting contracts, those sales team members typically are given some form of testing, whether
Mm,
it is DISC or Myers-Briggs or Gallup's um, Cliff. I can't remember what it's called, but there are numerous um, forms of testing that help give bigger pictures of what someone brings to the table.
mm,
But typically, at least in the US, the only people that take those tests, because they're not cheap. I mean, at the low end, they're probably $100 a person.
mm,
They're not, that's still doable, right? I mean, that's not exorbitant. But those are the ones that are getting tested. The people that are making the money, bringing it in for the company, are the ones that get the tests. The other leadership and certainly people in other key areas of that organization, but they're not the money makers, they're not bringing in funders of any form, they don't get that testing. And so as a result, the top leadership of any organization doesn't really know who works for them. They
mm,
don't have a picture of the landscape of their organization or business because they're only focused on the money making division. And
mm,
so, or the fundraising division if it's a nonprofit. So, focusing on and really understanding the gifts within the entire organization, then it also helps you know how are we best using the gift within the organization. Does this person, are they in the right position? They might belong in a wholly different department. um and you know what, it really would impact the bottom line as well, because if you have an employee stuck in a position that they're really not made for, they're not going to last. And we know that there are a lot of expenses involved with when you lose an employee and then you have to hire, you have to advertise, hire, train, and onboard a new employee. And to be able to avoid that entirely by saying, this person here is in the wrong position. How would you like to try this other position that we know based on your testing would be a much better fit for you? You'll be happier in your job. They'll probably be more productive. They'll certainly be a better team member in terms of what the organization is producing. And
mm.
so identifying and using those gifts more strategically, I think could be a really important play, for lack of a better word.
Oh,
That's
thank
strategy.
you very much. So, in a way, yeah, like, would you recommend that as lead integrity, probably we need to go through that kind of testing, like to
Yes,
evaluate what are our qualities and our strengths?
I think that would actually be brilliant, um, because I hadn't thought of it because I've already done a lot of it for
Yeah,
myself.
yeah.
But absolutely, here we are in the advent of a new form of coaching and strategy for people with lead integrity, and we're trying to better understand because we're so diverse
Mm-hmm,
organization ourselves.
mm-hmm.
I think it would be very valuable if each of, it's certainly all of the consultants, um,
Yes.
but advisors as well as anyone else that wind up coming into the mix. I think to have a better picture of where our strengths are. Because
Mm-hmm.
again, we may not be showcasing it. How many times have I had a conversation in lead integrity where I am still just a little bit, what do they call that when you see a rock star that you're smitten by? You kind of, there's a word for it. I'm just blanking out, but
Okay, you are the English speaker. I am not. So you better find the word, Michelle.
find the word. Um, I just feel, at times like I think I've used the term a babe among giants
Hmm.
because I have not been in the world of nonprofits or interfaith, multi-faith. I haven't been in global spheres per se. And so professionally, my experience feels so removed from the rest of the lead integrity team that I feel like I have so much to learn. And yet, at the same time, there's so much that I can bring that even I take for granted, right? When we
Hmm.
do gifts workshops, we find people all the time that they don't see the gifts in themselves. Sometimes others recognize their gifts, but they don't even see it because it's so much a part of them that they don't think of it as a gift or how they can use that in a way that will benefit um, the beloved community as well as their own organizations. And so I
Hmm.
think helping everybody see that would be very valuable. Yes,
Because in a way, it would also help us to work on which teams can work together.
exactly.
Because the pairing itself can also be very helpful if we find like these are the strengths, these are the weaknesses of this one can complement this one and the like. I think it would really be very helpful
Mhm.
to do that.
I agree.
So I look to you and say maybe next time we are meeting, this conversation you should you should strike this conversation. Yeah, yeah. No,
Absolutely.
thank you so much. I mean, I have so many other questions, but I also look at the time, the way I have taken so much of your time, and that this is a conversation that is ongoing. If you think of something that you want really from this conversation we've had, if you think of something that should be added to this conversation, please, I mean, do not hesitate. And if I have any other question, then we'll continue the conversation as well. But
Okay.
I'm very thankful because we have not just talked about the problems, but we've also talked about what are the possible solutions. And we have even talked about what would be the way forward with regards to our own leadership and our experience as lead integrity.
Well, I think that addresses both the lead and the leadership. Absolutely. And the integrity of keeping it, doing it in house, practice what you preach, right?
Yeah, precisely. Yeah.
Okay.
No, thank you so much. I don't know if you have last words or question or just a comment on what you think should also be included as an important question to this conversation as we continue to talk to other consultants.
Well, I think a responsible leader always looks for a possible solution.
Yeah.
And so I don't think a conversation like this that needs to happen uh, can responsibly happen without at least one question to each interviewee about how would you do it differently, or what
Mm-hmm.
would, if you had to do it all over again, what would
Mm-hmm.
that look like today in light of what you've learned, or simply what's a solution if we move forward and leaders
I'm adding the question.
training leaders, what is it that needs to be implemented?
What would you do differently?
If you had to do it all over again,
If,
knowing
yeah,
what you know
if,
now, how
yeah,
would you respond differently? And if not, that's okay, because that's telling as well.
okay. If not, it's okay. Yeah. And the other one you asked about,
The other one is what, just put simply, what could be a solution?
yeah.
And my solution came about just through our conversation.
Yeah, because that's what I was saying, that you talked about the problems and you gave the solutions as well. So if somebody doesn't do what you did, then these questions will be important and will really be important. Thank you so much. Eh?
Thank you. I actually really enjoyed this.